kind of questions that maybe we need to ask ourselves about the AI revolution that's taking place. So, I'm going to talk briefly about how brains perceive the world, a little bit about how computers function, how artificial intelligence, AI, is evolving, and of course, then the main purpose of my lecture is to reflect a little bit about what are the implications for homeopathy as a science and an art. So the real question is, and that's a question on many people's minds in the world at the moment, should we embrace or should we avoid artificial intelligence? And then some final reflections. So first we're going to do a little experiment, because it's about how our brains function. So just have a look and just tell me what's your first impression about the size of the dots? The red dot in particular.
Same.
Yes, but what's your first impression when you look at it?
Yeah, both this.
Yeah, pointer is functioning, that's good. So, yeah, this is a trick question, obviously, but actually the dots are of the same size. But, of course, somehow our brains tempt us to think that this dot is larger. So, what does that say? That means that the way we perceive the world is determined by the way how we frame the world. And so, in this case, the fact that the red dot appeared bigger, now from a purely scientific point of view, we would say that's a bias, that was a distortion. Actually, our brain distorted the reality, and so this is what scientists would say, that's a bias, that's a distortion, that's something we have to avoid at all costs. But it's also a confirmation that our brains look at things in context. So, what does our brain do? Our brain looks at the whole picture. And then we say, okay, what's the size of the dot? Now, so our brain goes from the whole picture, looks at all the gray dots and the red dot in the middle. And it focuses on the part, the red dot. But, very importantly, what our brain tends to do, it will look then again at that red dot in the context of the whole picture. And so, our brain tends to look at things in context. Now, here we said in this particular trick question that led to a bias. But there is also something very important about our brains, about looking in context. And we'll get back to that. So, misjudging the size of the dots, different perspectives are possible, including, obviously, a biased one. Now, so let's get to computer. Now, obviously, if we were to ask a computer, what's the size of the red dot? What do you think? Is the computer get it right, or is the computer going to get it wrong? Right. Exactly. So, because computers are very good at measuring the diameter of the red dot and ignoring the context, because the computer will simply say, you're asking what's the size of the red dot. So the computer will just completely narrowly focus on that, ignore everything else, and get the answer right. So, one conclusion is that a computer can be better than humans at certain things. We're going to do a second experiment. Just have a look at the picture. It's a lovely picture. It seems pretty boring. And, but this picture has been used by social scientists. And they asked, basically they asked the students from the United States and Japan to look at this picture. They said, oh, look at this picture for 10, 20 seconds. And then afterwards they asked them, how much detail do you remember of the picture? Can you tell us in a little bit? And they had to fill in things. And so obviously, the same picture is perceived differently. What happens? Everybody observed the big fish, so it's hard to miss the big fish. You say, oh yeah, there's a big fish there. But the difference was about how much detail the observers remembered about the background. For instance, there's a little frog there, there's some little plants there, little fish in the corner there. So what happened is that the people from Japan, and what we can say, what cultural scientists would argue, that people in the Orient, they tend to focus more at the whole. They look at the whole picture. Of course, they also see the parts, but they approach this picture more holistically. Now, what happens in the West? In the West, we are very much conditioned by focusing on the parts. And so it's a so the culture can also lead to bias. Our cultural, the culture has been defined by social scientists as the collective programming of the mind. So all our minds are programmed. We are all programmed by our cultures. So we all have cultural biases. But what we see in the West is because there is this cultural bias towards looking at the parts and sometimes to forget about the whole thing. So in the West we see this predominant issue of that there is very much an emphasis on reductionism. We want to focus really on the parts. So the US, in conclusion, the US students, they saw the big fish and they remembered far little about the small fishes and the little things in the background. Whereas the Japanese students, they remembered much more about the background. It's just an illustration that we are all programmed by our own culture, and that can also lead to us perceiving the world differently, the same thing, differently from someone from another culture. So perception, it was said in the Talmud, is that we do not see things as they are, but we see things as we are. And so we basically, one important lesson as a scientist, having been a scientist for 30 to 40 years, which I have to draw, is that the lesson is that you learn, is that you have to be humble, because you have to accept that you can be wrong, you have to accept that you can be biased. So, but as we've shown in the beginning, bias also makes us uniquely human. I will get back to that. So, in conclusion, our perception and what we know is influenced by how we engage with the world. And we can engage with the world in different ways. So, brief 2 slides about different ways of knowing. So we're getting a little bit to the philosophy of science here. So there's more than one way of engaging with the world, but we've already seen that. A US person will engage with the world differently from a Japanese person. And so now in German, this word knowing, there's 2 terms. There's wissen and there's kennen. Now, the English language, one of the reasons why it's so popular is that the English language tends to be rather imprecise. And so, if you put that in the best translator, DeepL, then it says, can you translate these words? And basically they say, well, knowledge, knowing, know. it's all a bit the same. Something that's distinct in the German cultural perspective is a bit fuzzy in the English cultural perspective. Now, I've asked some of my friends from China, I said, well, can you translate this word, Wissen and Kennen, into Mandarin? Well, I'm not an expert in Mandarin, I have to admit, but this picture looks very different from that picture. So, definitely in the Chinese cultural mindset, for them, they understand that this is one concept and that's another concept that's different. But then I decided, why don't I back translate it into English? I said, well, can you back translate this thing from Chinese into English? And then a differentiation emerged. Because Wissen was knowledge. So that's, you see the bias in the translator already, that the deep L said, well, yeah, Wissen is knowledge. But when we back translated this, it says understand. And so, I want to say something about what does it mean to understand something? And a very brief etymological journey, to stand under, in English, literally you're saying, to understand something you stand under. But I'm from Holland, so in Dutch you translate it as verstaan. And verstaan means I stand in front of you. So to understand something implies a sense of proximity, to stand close to. So it means it's linked to understanding by an individual. It's something that's embodied and personal. If I understand a person, if a homeopath understands a patient, that's something that emerges from that very personal interaction that you have as a homeopath with your patient. So knowledge, Wissen, emphasizes separation, a distance between the subject and the object. And this is, of course, what we see in Wissenschaft, which is the translation of science. In science, we place an emphasis on objectivity. We want to create a distance. We want to say we want to objectively observe reality. We want to avoid this subjectivity that comes from this proximity of understanding. We want to objectively understand and focus on that objective knowledge. And so what we see here is the separation between the subject and the object. And most philosophers of science would say, yes, that is a result of Cartesian thinking. We have had 200 years of enlightenment, and definitely in the Western world, we are very much programmed by trying to see separation between the subject and the object. So now, what I want to say here is that intelligence has a knowledge component, but it also has an understanding component. There's to reality, there's Wissen, and there's Kennen. So a German person would understand very well what I'm saying. Now let's go with this background and come back to this topic of artificial intelligence. And so if we compare artificial intelligence to human performance, what we see here is this line is the human performance as a benchmark, which is put as a 0 here. Now, so in 1998, you see, this was completely, everything was, it hardly existed, so it only started to emerge. And this is 2023, so this is fairly recent data. Every year, this comes from Our World in Data. It's a very interesting website. They update these surveys every year. And what you can see is that in the last, well, you could say 10 years, artificial intelligence, it's shot up, and actually, in terms of reading comprehension, image recognition, language understanding, handwriting recognition, speech recognition is more or less at the same level, and predictive reasoning. But what you can see is that there's an enormous development, that artificial intelligence is getting better at many things than humans. So the conclusion is, yes, artificial intelligence definitely is getting better at us than doing things. And as we already saw from the beginning, this simple example I gave, yeah, computers are better at certain things than humans. So, we can't deny this. I mean, this thing is happening around us. Now, we can say we don't like it or we like it. And that's a question also that they're asked. They're asked to people all over the world. They say, well, you know, are you excited about artificial intelligence or are you a bit afraid? And so this is the latest survey that they did. And so this blue line, I'm not going to go into details of all the countries, but the blue lines is artificial products and services driven product makes you feel excited. Or the red line is artificial intelligence driven products and services make you feel nervous. So the red line is negative emotions associated and the blue line is positive. Now, what you see is that in the red line here, you see a lot of countries from Europe. It's a big cluster. United States, very negative. The negative, the fear, is prevailing over the excitement, even though a lot of this stuff is invented in the United States. And so this is quite an interesting thing, that it's a mixed bag. So artificial intelligence makes people feel excited as well as afraid. And definitely there's different cultural perspectives, again, about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So, after this introduction, what are the possible implications of homeopathy? So I want to give a few reflections on that. Now, homeopathy is a very data-intensive discipline. And what we've seen with repertories and things like that, homeopaths in general, they have been early adopters of information technology because there's so much information to process, so why not use information technology to help you with that? And homeopathy involves pattern recognition. And AIs are better than humans at many domains, including pattern recognition. And what we see in the previous presentation, certain patterns associated with certain types of emotions can sometimes be picked up by AI as well. Better than we might do, or we just get low, we wouldn't see the detail. And so what we can see is understanding the patient's symptoms in a natural language is very important in homeopathy because we really listen to the patients, the sensations, the modalities, the description, the delusions, the descriptions, the personal descriptions by the patient are considered very important in the homeopathy. It happens that within artificial intelligence, there are these things called large language models. Don't ask me what it is, because as I said, I'm not an expert in AI, but generally speaking, the consensus is that these large language models are pretty good at natural language, which is also what we saw in that slide, that when it comes to translation, language, even seeing language in context, to understand the context of a sentence, AIs are already getting better than humans at translating and seeing things in context. And again, the Mathematica is very text-based. If we look at the provings, then in provings we have all these verbatim descriptions of patients. So there is that origin of a prover with a very rich narrative of that prover's experience. And so, theoretically, yes, the AI models are very amenable to understand that and maybe to bring that to the attention of the homeopath. So, possibilities and limitations. So, what we could conceive in pharmacies, for instance, is that a patient goes into a pharmacy, patient has a cold or a self-limiting disease, and they go, there's a little chatbot, and it says, oh, well, how do you feel? Oh, I have a runny nose, And the patient would then interact with some sort of chatbot. The chatbot would maybe ask 5 or 10 questions, and the chatbot would give LMHI or euphrasia, or so actually that's something for self-limiting conditions, for instance in pharmacies. There would be a great potential for AI to help patients find more or less an individualized remedy for self-limiting condition. But of course now I already hear the question mark in the air. What about the treatment of more complex conditions, of chronic conditions? And what would be the role? Could now we say, oh, the patient just sits, the patient with a complicated chronic condition just sits in front of a very fancy chat box, and instead of asking 10 questions, it will ask 100 questions, and remedy comes out. So, but then the question is, what's the role of the homeopath as an expert in this process? And so, coming back to the title of my lecture, big data, can we harness the benefits of big data and artificial intelligence, but what about the art of homeopathy? Can we maintain the art? And so, we can ask the reverse question. Now, can we say, are there certain competencies, human competencies that we have, that AIs can't reach? Now, this is very much an open discussion. This discussion is happening as we speak, and probably some of the answers that people would give now, in 1 or 2 years, they would say, well, there were certain things that we thought they're really within the competencies of humans, that in 2 or 3 years we realized, no, actually, AIs are already better than that. So this is very much a moving process. But what about humor? Now, they have also, you can go to ChatGPT and say, do a funny, tell me some jokes. And the BBC, they did a little experiment where they did a chatbot and a comedian, and then they, in front of an audience, they tested, are people really laughing at those jokes from the AI? And, well, at least the conclusion of that experiment was, yeah, the AI humor is not necessarily very creative. You know, they would have picked up certain things from that people say are funny, but I think the real sense of the humor is that in the very moment the creative process takes place and you make some sort of funny jump in your thinking, and people say, yeah, that's funny. What about wisdom? We were already saying there's a difference between understanding and knowing, as I told. And said, so what about humility? What about wise people are generally considered to be people who can look at a problem from multiple angles. And it could be argued that AIs, how wise are AIs? Yeah, that can be challenged. You could still argue, look, human beings can be wise, but an AI can only sort of do how it's programmed. So, again, one of the conclusions is that understanding, that proximity associated with understanding, and so the embodied aspect. So if you as a homeopath, you have a consultation with your patient, and you show empathy to that patient, you connect to the patient. So there's something, an understanding that's really personal and embodied. And the embodied aspect of that, a machine can't do. You can teach a machine to ask the right question. Oh, how are you feeling? Oh, yes, I really understand how you're feeling. I'm sorry. So you can teach an AI to fake, to be empathetic. But can you really teach an AI to show that embodied empathy? So, concluding, the founder of evidence-based medicine, David Sackett, says, Evidence-based medicine, practice-based medicine, is how to apply the best possible evidence in making decisions in the care of the individual patient. So this aspect is that the expert judges, in the context of the individual patient, what's the best process. And so, what do we do in homeopathy? We have a holistic approach. We start with the whole, the patient as a whole. And then we listen to the patient, we listen to the symptoms. Then we analyze these symptoms. Of course, we go to the parts, because the symptoms, the patient's symptoms, are bits and pieces and parts that we then analyze as parts. But, of course, in the end, the remedy decision, then you can have a rubberization, then you can have things that support you in analyzing the parts, but then in the end, you have to go back to the whole patient. And this is what I was saying about the holistic worldview. You go from the whole, you go to the parts, and then you go back to the whole. So the AI would be able to assist in step 2. AIs can be very good, and repertories are very good in analyzing the parts. And so, but the consultation, the understanding the patient, in an ideal situation, the AI would take away the attention of the homeopath for analyzing these parts and looking at those parts. The AI could do part of that, whereas the homeopath could really focus on this interaction with the patient, on understanding the patient, and that's what homeopaths are good at. That's the embodied part that AIs cannot do. And you could ask the AI, look at it from multiple perspectives. Can you approach this problem from multiple perspectives? Because our limitations as human beings is that we have this thing that's called confirmation bias, that we all approach, we perceive the world as we are. So in AI, you could ask, hey, can you look at this problem from a completely different angle? So all of a sudden, an AI could help you to say, well, my intuition told me to go down this train of thought, but hey, there is also another way of looking at this. And so it can generate and foster what we call reflective competence. So to conclude, homeopathy can integrate a scientific worldview with a holistic worldview. And my argument is that we can really take inspiration from the East, because thinking holistically is not in the DNA of many people in the West. And that's why, of course, when there's attacks on homeopathy, and people say, oh, where is the molecule? There's no molecule that demonstrates homeopathy. There's very much this focus on the parts. And skeptics have a much easier time in the West because there's this cultural bias towards looking at the parts. So we can take inspiration from the East. And as long as the AI does not become the master, as long as the AI is embedded, going from the whole to the parts, back to the whole, as long as the AI is the servant, our vision, and my vision at least, is that AI can empower the whole. Thank you very much.